Hey guys, I just wanted to pop in and let you know that what you're about to listen to is the first half of our conversation with our special guest, philosopher and neuroscientist David Barrack. The conversation just went longer than a normal episode, so I've split it into two, so it'll just cut off at the end of this episode, and we'll pick up right where we left off in next month's episode. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of neuroscience-y people. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
And I'm David.
And the topic for this episode is what is an explanation, and specifically what is an explanation in computational neuroscience. So we're going to be talking about mathematical modeling and what counts as an explanation when we use mathematical models, and what doesn't count and why does it not count, and topics like that. And so for this, we read a paper called Explanation and Description in Computational Neuroscience, and that's by David Michael Kaplan, which is in the journal Synthesize from 2011. I don't actually know if that's how you pronounce that journal name.
Synthesize, but whatever.
Sure. Synthesize, okay. And this was, I heard about this article via Christopher White on Twitter when I asked for recommendations of this kind, and it seemed to be then endorsed by many other neuroscientists. So it's possibly a reasonable reflection of what people like and care about from the neuroscience perspective. And so to help us discuss this, we have a real live philosopher
Hi, guys.
to guide us through this. So David, do you want to further introduce yourself?
Sure. My whole name, I'm David Barrack. I am a philosopher and a neuroscientist at Columbia. I have a PhD in philosophy from Duke. I wrote my dissertation on the use of dynamical systems theory in cognitive neuroscience. And while I was at Duke, I was a member of the interdisciplinary program in cognitive neuroscience, and I worked in the laboratory of Michael Platt doing single-unit electrophysiology in non-human primates. And I continued to be a neuroscientist as well as a philosopher here at Columbia, where I study reasoning in the laboratory of Daniel Salzman here. And I study reasoning both from a philosophical and a neuroscientific perspective. So I study the conceptual and theoretical foundations of reasoning in philosophy, as well as performing neural recordings in non-human primates in reasoning tasks in the lab using, again, single-unit electrophysiology. So recording from the activity of single neurons in the monkey's brain while they make decisions.
All right, so clearly well suited for this conversation.
Indeed.
So the way this paper is laid out is there's kind of concepts that are put forth in the beginning and a little bit of kind of trying to describe some previous arguments and how the thesis that the author is putting forth relates to them, and then they go into details about specific examples in computational neuroscience. And we're going to try to go through their argument and define the terms that are relevant and make references to examples, but if we don't get through all of that, I won't be totally surprised. I think this is just a nice piece to use as a starting off point to talk about these concepts because they're kind of implicit to what we do in computational neuroscience. We usually assume we're contributing some kind of understanding or explanation, so this is a nice way to be more concrete about what that means. David, would you like to tell us a bit about the place of this paper in the larger philosophical sphere?
I'm happy to. So this is an interesting paper and certainly advances what I see to be a helpful framework for understanding the role of modeling and constructing explanations in neuroscience, and in particular it pushes a particular thesis about mechanisms and the role of mechanisms in explanations in computational and cognitive neuroscience. So just to give you guys a little bit of a flavor, so explanations, of course, are one of the central products of the scientific enterprise. Scientists produce theories, they produce discoveries, they also produce explanations. And a major question in the philosophy of science has to do with the nature of scientific explanation. What does an explanation in science look like? How do scientists go about constructing explanations? And that means sort of what are the elements of an explanation, and how do explanations relate to the other aspects of science, and so forth. In the history of the philosophy of scientific explanation, for about 40 years, the dominant model was something called the deductive nomological model. And that just means that the typical way that philosophers understood scientists to go about constructing explanations involved describing essentially universal laws, like the universal law of gravitation you might remember from physics. And then you list a set of initial conditions. And for the universal law of gravitation, that would be things like the masses of the two objects and the distance between them. And you sort of plug and play with the universal law, and you get, as a deduction, the force of gravity, in the case of the example I'm using, between the two objects. So the idea is that you have a law-like statement, you have a statement of the current conditions, and then you can deduce the thing you're trying to explain, which in this case would be the force of attraction between the two objects. That model, which is called the covering law model or the deductive nomological model, really was the dominant model for about 40 years, but there are issues with it. I'll just mention one. Famously, the model makes some peculiar claims about what it can explain what. So if you think about a flagpole casting a shadow, you might want to say that the flagpole, in some sense, explains the shadow. Given the height of the sun in the sky and the length of the flagpole, you can determine the length of the shadow cast by the flagpole. Now, the problem is that from the length of the shadow together with the height of the sun in the sky, you can deduce the height of the flagpole. And so on that model, that covering law model I just described, the length of the shadow and the height of the sun explain the height of the flagpole equally as well as the length of the flagpole and the height of the sun in the sky explain the length of the shadow. So that's one example. There's numerous other counterexamples.
So is this roughly to say that the model, like this framework, does not talk about causality, or is that?
That is one of the main objections. That's right.
So like because just to be clear, so like you would start with some law which describes a relationship between variables or something like this, but not like the causal relationship between these variables.
Exactly.
And so when you try to derive or deduce something from that law, given some conditions, you can kind of guess what the other thing should be or predict what the other thing should be, but you don't know.
That's right.
Which one. Yeah,
That's right. So it's deduction. You pointed out just now that that model of explanation sort of sees a symmetry between prediction and explanation. Explanation is kind of backward looking in some way. You already have the fact in hand, you're trying to explain it. Prediction basically works the same way, you just haven't actually done the measurements yet, but again, it's a kind of deduction. There's a number of other associated sort of theses with that model, but as I said, there's a number of unfortunate conclusions that the model makes, and one of them is what I just mentioned, is this problem with shadows explaining the heights of the objects that cast them and so forth. There's problems with common causes. There's a number of other famous problems, and these sort of came to a head in the early and mid-70s when a philosopher named Wesley Salmon came up with an alternative model for scientific explanation, which explicitly addresses this oversight of the causal structure of the world. It's called the causal mechanical model. And the causal mechanical model basically says, well, what scientists are actually doing is they are attempting to describe some aspect of the causal structure of the world, and when they're giving a successful explanation, they are accurately capturing something about that causal structure. That model is ascendant, and I would say now dominant, certainly for biology and the other life sciences, but even increasingly in the harder sciences. And its current manifestation is in the form of mechanism. So there's really a focus on the mechanistic aspects of the causal mechanical view. And there is a group of philosophers who kind of even by their own accord, go by this label of the new mechanist. So mechanism was originally a thesis in 17th and 18th century philosophy. Those are the original mechanists. Just to give you an idea of, philosophy's been around forever, right? So believe it or not, these 17th century philosophers, they're called the moderns, even though they're 400 years old. And these philosophers really developed the first mechanical philosophy, where they thought everything was made of something called corpuscles. They're these little atom-like things, and different shaped corpuscles gave rise to all of the wonderful phenomena of the world.
Just to get a sense from the the history of this, was this like contemporaneous with Newton discovering
Correct.
these kinds of physical laws, or but did it sort of precede or follow? Was it a reaction to Newton coming up with physical principles?
Newton really is part of this corpuscularian philosophy, and he was really doing his work at the time. Bacon and Robert Hooke and all these the sort of first generation of scientists following the Galilean revolution, the scientific revolution. And they're the ones who are really laying down this new kind of approach. They also, at this time, you have to keep in mind that philosophy and science were not distinguished at that time. They considered themselves natural philosophers. It's only very recently in the 20th century that you really see a distinction between science and philosophy, an unfortunate break, in my opinion. But so these individuals explicitly had this corpuscularian philosophy. They thought everything could be explained mechanically, or most things anyways, certainly natural phenomena. And the new mechanists, and David Kaplan is certainly the author of the paper we're discussing. He's certainly one of these new mechanists. They have explicitly taking on this mantle of mechanism, and they're combining it with this causal mechanical view of scientific explanation, sort of the new locus classicus, the new classical locus of in the literature for this view, was a paper published in 2000 by Karl Craver and Peter Mackamer and Lindley Darden on mechanism in the Journal of Philosophy of Science. And David Kaplan has worked and has published with Karl Craver a lot, who's one of the authors of that seminal 2000 paper. And so what David is doing is he's taking this mechanistic view of scientific explanation and he's extending it to computational what he calls computational neuroscience.
Cool. So like this is, I think that gives it like a really good overview and a context for it in the sort of from a philosophical perspective.
Right.
So maybe like we'll get into this maybe more specifically in computational neuroscience as we elaborate and go through the paper. But maybe one more sort of high level point. Could you take a stab at defining mechanism as it's used in this philosophical literature?
Sure, very easy.
You mean what came before?
No. Well, I mean, maybe even like start with the definition of mechanism, or like the original definition of mechanism, if there was one, and then maybe the new definition,
and then move to the new one. So the modernist or corpuscularian, like Newton or Hooke, de la Mettrie is a French philosopher who's one of the best embodiments of this view. I don't know if they had as strict a definition as certainly contemporary, what's known as analytic philosophy, would maintain. So in those days, philosophy was more what you might sort of picked up in the Great Books program or something like that, where I think of it as like capital P philosophy, these guys who are sitting around thinking about the big ideas. Around the turn of the 20th century, you had a professionalization of philosophy, and it became one branch of philosophy is called analytic philosophy. It became much more logical and mathematical, and that's also the tradition within which the mechanists, the new mechanists, are working. And turning to these new mechanists, again, of which Kaplan is an exemplar. There is a definition that they use, the very clear definition. Contemporary analytic philosophy stresses formal definitions and being as clear as possible. And the definition they use, it's called the Mackamer-Darden-Craver definition, the MDC mechanisms you'll see in the literature. And it goes something like, a mechanism is a set of entities and activities that are organized so as to produce the explanandum phenomenon. So that's a little bit of a gobbledygook. So let me unpack that a little bit. So essentially, what that definition says is that there's a set of things, what they call entities, which are the pieces or the parts. According to these new mechanists, they're often spatio-temporally characterized. And I don't want to paint too monolithic a picture. Some of them think they have to be these physical pieces. Others are a little bit more liberal in what can count as a part. And then on par with the parts are what they call activities. And activities would be things like lifting and turning and other kinds of things that these entities can do. And the entities and the activities are organized, and that can be a causal organization or a spatial-temporal organization. Those are the two main types of organization that these philosophers talk about, so as to produce the explanandum phenomenon. So let me unpack that end part a little bit. So mechanisms are productive. They do things in the world. They produce something. And in this case, what they're producing is what in fancy philosophical language is called an explanandum phenomenon. So phenomenon is just something that happens. We can think of that in common sense terms. But an explanandum, that's like a fancy philosopher's term for the thing that you're trying to explain. Explanations are composed of explanans, which do the explaining, and explananda, which are the things that are being explained. So the explanand...
Which is just the Latin for those.
That's correct, yeah.
Those, yeah.
And so the definition that these guys are using, and actually in the paper, Kaplan does allude to this definition, is this idea of sets of entities and activities organized so as to produce the explanandum phenomenon.
Cool.
I think the next step that we need to get into is to talk about the definition of computational neuroscience.
Ooh, man, I agree with that.
I think in this paper, he defines it in a footnote, which seems like an odd choice for a paper about explanation in computational neuroscience, at least for a philosophical paper, where in my mind, half of the work of philosophy is defining things. So he brings up the idea of computational neuroscience just being when mathematical tools or computer science tools are applied to neuroscience, and then I think alludes to also some people mean the study of the computations of the brain. And to me, those are very different definitions. You can use math for a lot of things in neuroscience, and you can ask questions about the computations of the brain without using math if you want to. I wouldn't advise it, but you could. So I think he then carries on with the first definition of it just being the use of mathematical tools in neuroscience, but also at some point refers to it as a higher level field on par with cognitive science, which I thought was the other use at play then, because it's only higher level if you think it's about the computations. The use of math doesn't necessarily make it a higher level field.
So without judging that for a moment, though, I think I do agree that is the definition that most computational neuroscientists would subscribe to. That is
the math one.
The sort of the first one, the general one, that like anything where you use math to analyze neuroscience-derived data or model the brain or model the computations performed by the brain, all of that is kind of very crudely called computational neuroscience by people who call themselves computational neuroscientists.
Yeah.
I think that's right. There's two very important threads in the recent history of neuroscience. One is they're both born out of the computer revolution, ultimately arising from Turing and Church and the other early computational scientists. But they manifest in the following way. The first, through the cognitive revolution in cognitive psychology in the 1960s, as a result of the application of ideas from computational science, from computer science to psychology, you have this idea of the brain as a computer. In other words, you have this idea of the brain as transforming something like digit strings or, something like some kind of internal representation into an output of some kind. And that was first formalized by a paper in 1944, I think, by McCulloch and Pitts. And ever since then, you've had this idea in neuroscience, especially in cognitive neuroscience, which is explicitly the combination of cognitive science and cognitive psychology with neuroscience. But then you have an entirely different thread, which is just the increasing, and this is true across the sciences, of course, the use of computers in modeling to model complex phenomena, of which the brain is, the sine qua non.
So the second would be more like, like the same way that like weather analysis has gotten very quantitative, or like geosciences are very quantitative. You just get large data sets, and then you're going to, of course, use computers and statistics and contemporary machine learning methods to analyze data derived from those. And the first that you described is more like a philosophical commitment to a certain way of thinking about the brain as a computer, or like the relationships between the brain and a computing
that's
system.
exactly right. Now, what's interesting about that analogy, I like that analogy. And what's interesting about it, as John Sorrell likes to say, that simulated thunderstorms don't grow wheat. But if you're an adherent to that, the thesis of cognitive revolution, which is that thinking is a type of computation, then when you're modeling computationally what the brain is doing from a cognitive perspective, it is literally thinking. So unlike a modeled thunderstorm, if you're modeling object recognition, you are actually recognizing objects. That's the one of the key.
Yeah.
When you marry those two threads, that's what you get. It's the use of computational methods to literally recreate the phenomenon that you're studying.
And that's the simulation side of it. But there's also one other sort of division that I want to sort of bring up that I think is relevant, certainly when thinking about the kind of computational machinery that we're talking about with the brain, is sort of like a bit of a computer science versus like an electrical engineering kind of distinction. There are people who, like more in philosophy and psychology and cognitive science, who maybe think of the brain more as like, and this comes up, I believe he calls it, what does he call it? Cognitive chauvinism?
Computational chauvinism.
Computational chauvinism, which would be like that, the brain is some hardware, but it's like a generic enough hardware that you can think about like the software that the brain is implementing and study those computations. And there's a sort of second view that I think is more common amongst people with a sort of biological neuroscience, physiology background, which is that like the particular implementations are not necessarily the only ways you could implement the computations that are performed by the brain, but like as we're studying the brain, there's something particularly interesting about studying the details, the implementation details of the way the brain actually does what it does. And the reason I say this is almost like the electrical engineering view of neuroscience is because at least historically, electrical engineers built computers like special purpose to like realize the processes that they were trying to compute, right? Historically, computers, before the sort of contemporary general purpose computing, there were analog computers where you would say, this is the math that I want to implement. I want some input-output relationship. And then you would have sort of electrical engineers design special purpose computing hardware to realize that computation. And that kind of thinking about how computations are performed through a physical computer, like a physical implementation of that computation, is maybe more aligned with the idea that the sort of physiology of the brain is specifically implementing some computation. And you can think about them as separate, but like when studying the brain, you want to study them jointly.
So we can go into more detail about what the computational chauvinism said and how it differs from that perspective, because what you're saying is that the hardware does matter for the software, and it would make sense to think of them jointly, potentially. In the case of engineering something, you think about the software but as you design the hardware. And the chauvinistic viewpoint, which I enjoy as the name for it, says that basically the mind can be studied independently of the brain. So the facts of the implementation, the way that neurons are and brains are, that won't matter for understanding the programs that are running on the brain. They are truly independent in some way, such that one needn't care about the brain if they want to know about the mind.
Yes. So Kaplan talks about this, and he says, he cites some well-known cognitive scientists, Philip Johnson Laird and Zenon Plishin, and of course famously Jerry Fodor. I am a little hesitant to attribute to these thinkers as robust a thesis as that they literally think you don't need to study the brain at all. Jerry Fodor, who only passed away, I think, last year now, unfortunately, a very prolific philosopher of mind, cognitive scientist at Rutgers, he famously wrote a paper about what he called methodological solipsism, this idea that different subjects can exist independently of or autonomously, in the language that Kaplan uses, from these other disciplines. And then I think what I have been told about this is that he immediately regretted it in some ways, because it is a really strong claim. This idea that you can completely, in the abstract, without looking at the implementational details at all, uncover the character of the signal processing operations that the brain is using in order to generate behavior. And I think that any reasonable neuroscientist, certainly, maybe it's because we have some money in the game, so to speak, is going to say, no, of course you need to look at the implementation. But I actually think that's probably true of most psychologists and cognitive scientists as well, that it's always going to be the case that you're going to want to take into account both the abstract details, but as well the implementational details. I also want to say and put some stress, a little bit of a stress on this idea that you can even clearly distinguish between the implementational details, the mere details about what's wired to what and how the different channels and the neurons are working and things like that, from these more abstract characterizations. It seems to me that it's always going to be dependent on the level at which you're describing the system. So for one scientist who's studying, for example, you might say, if you're a neuroimager or something like that, you might have a certain view of electrophysiologists, like what I do, where you have an assessment of the neural activity at the level of individual neurons or groups of neurons. You might say, oh, well, that's implementation detail, because I'm just studying these very gross...
How brain regions interact.
Brain region changes in blood flow in brain regions and things like that. But, if you ask me as an electrophysiologist, I'm going to say I'm still not at the implementation, really. If you really want to talk about it, I'm just recording extracellular impulses. The electrical signals I'm recording are from my electrode sits outside the neuron, and I'm just picking up the electrical signals that happen to be going by my electrode. And the real implementational details are those biophysical details. The physiology, you got to go down to the slice physiologists and talk to them. And if you go talk to the slice physiologists, they might say something like, oh, I don't know, I'm not really, you ought to talk to the biophysics people. You got to talk to the people who are doing membrane experiments. And so there's different levels, for lack of a better word, at which to describe the system. And I think what counts as implementational detail, it might be relative to the level at which a particular scientist is operating.
I think that's definitely true and kind of comes up a lot in neuroscience. People have their preferred levels at which they work, and things are all relative to that. But I think also, even if you just settle on a particular, this is implementation and this is not, there's a silliness to this view. Like, if you want to understand just behavior, like input output for behavior, and you never look inside the brain, which by some definition you could say is the goal of psychology before neuroscience kind of got fused to it, you could try to do that. You can try to make all the mappings between what a person sees and what they do afterwards, or what happened in their life and who they become later on. You could try to do all these mappings, but why constrain yourself to only use that data? Why not look at the thing that generates those mappings if it might help you understand them?
I totally agree. And let's suppose even it is the case that there is this utterly abstract level of description of what the system is doing, such that you never need to invoke anything about its material constitution at all. Even if that's true, it might still be, just as a practical, pragmatic matter, a good recommendation might be to look at the system itself anyways, because it's more data, it's going to give you more hints about what the system is doing, what the system could be doing in order to accomplish the goal. For example, if I really want to understand object recognition, maybe I could have a research program that's utterly divorced from how animals actually recognize objects. But as a matter of scientific expediency, it might behoove me to pay attention to what the system is actually doing, because that might give me a clue as to what those algorithms are, or what those computations are.
Yeah. And I think Kaplan talks about this in the context of functional analysis, because I think what he was saying is that if you have this chauvinist viewpoint, a way that you might try to understand the brain is through functional analysis, which means you take a capacity and break it down into subcapacities, but those subcapacities don't necessarily map onto anything physical or anything on the level of implementation details. And so that's something you could try to do if you want to say, I'm not going to care about implementation details. But then the only means of kind of testing your theory is its ability to predict, a future input-output pair. Whereas if you allow the data from the implementation level, that's another way to say if your theory is right. If you can find things that map onto parts of your high-level description in the lower-level implementation. So it's also just a way to check for some form of the veracity of the model that you've put forth.
Yeah. Also, there's a really nice argument from a philosopher named Daniel Dennett on this very issue. So I have some bones to pick, I suppose, about how Kaplan characterizes functional analysis, because he really presents it in a way where, especially with regard to Robert Cummins, where he makes it seem like these functional analyses are being proposed totally independent of any kind of care for the implementation. But if you look at the history of functional analysis, certainly in the Cummins book that he cites, but also in Daniel Dennett's work and Bill Likens' work, another philosopher, the idea of functional analysis was to break apart these complex cognitive capacities into simpler ones, the subcapacities, take those subcapacities, break those into even simpler ones, the sub-subcapacities, and so on until you arrived at operations that were so simple it was very easy to understand how very simple elements in a system like the brain could perform them. That was the intent. And Daniel Dennett even makes
it's a kind of reductionism? I mean,
yes,
okay.
That's right. And Daniel Dennett makes the point that if you don't do that, in other words, if you give up bottoming out your explanation of the cognitive capacity in simple operations that can be performed by basic elements like neurons, then what happens is that in terms of your explanation, you have kind of leftover psychology, so to speak, to expunge from your theory in a way that you don't know how. The idea was to use this kind of, they called it a homuncular functionalism, because the idea was to take a very complex cognitive capacity and break it into slightly less intelligent homunculi, little dudes in the mind, and then to take those homunculi and break them into slightly stupider until you get really stupid homunculi who can do
it's plausible that you could build a little.
That's right. And his point is that if you don't bottom it out in something that the brain or whatever the physical device is that's actually performing the operations, if you don't bottom out somehow in that physical device, then you're left with these homunculi. It's, that have not been expunged from the system. And really what happens if you've lost explanatory power. And so functional analysis in its philosophical genesis was never meant as something that was to ignore the implementation. It was a series of sort of preparatory steps in order for the psychological phenomenon to be analyzed and shaped in a way that allows it to converse with the neuroscience or whatever you think the system is being the system that you're working with is made from.
Is it assumed that the hierarchy of capacities and subcapacities can be mapped on to hierarchies of implementation? Like, is the level above a neuron in the subcapacity hierarchy a group of neurons?
So, not necessarily. Zen implicit has this really helpful concept of a functional architecture. And the functional architecture in a computational system is basically the step below, it's the next step below your first level of homunculi, so to speak. It's the next step below the first level of what he would talk about as content or representational content. So the idea was to analyze things in such a way that you break it down to as basic as possible for it to interact at that level with the next level down where it's all neuro or it's all electrical engineering or whatever it is. And different thinkers will think that's going to occur at different levels. But above that level, the physical stuff implements in some sense the computations, but it doesn't connect directly in the way that it doesn't need to anyways. I don't want to say it never does. For some thinkers it does, but it doesn't need to. So for some thinkers it doesn't.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I obviously I'm a neuroscientist and a philosopher, so I think that studying the brain is a fruitful enterprise. I've never really understood the claim that of explanatory or methodological autonomy.
So just to be clear, the author of this paper is not advocating for that.
He's not. Yeah, but my worry is that it's a little strawmannish. That I'm wondering who really does think that. It's not obvious to me that when you take into account all of the context within which these thinkers are making these claims, that you really get a position as robust as.
So I don't know. I mean, my sort of experience interacting with neuroscientists, psychologists, cognitive scientists over the years is that there are people who lie along this spectrum. There are people who, many people who do work on analyzing the brain using fMRI maybe care a bit about monkey studies that show that the stuff that they're seeing in the fMRI data that they analyze can be related to the brain, like through monkey studies, but they mostly are using that as sort of like grounding for the work that they care about, which is like human cognition studied via fMRI. It's like a tethering of some sort. And I see even further like people who are interested in, like, for example, just the cognitive strategies that an organism or a human use when solving a certain task. And they might look to fMRI data to say, like, oh yeah, and the brain represents these quantities when humans are solving these tasks. But they certainly wouldn't really care about studying animals or sort of neural circuits that underlie these things. And I think it is, I mean, Grace hinted at this before, but I mean, this is sort of a straightforward point generally, right? Like, that it depends on what questions you're asking. And I think you can frame cognitive science questions or psychology questions clearly enough in a way that they, I mean, this idea of autonomy is maybe quite strong, and maybe no one believes it, and it's like, literally, this field is entirely independent of the fields below
exactly.
it. Right.
Yeah,
like that's the philosophical extreme of this point.
Yeah,
but I think there are a lot of people who essentially pragmatically believe that. Like, for the purposes of their research, they've operationalized their research at a level that is removed from much beneath. They recognize that they'll look one layer down just for sort of a sanity check.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with that. I think I mean, you can't keep all of the layers in mind.
Sure.
We'd all have to study physics and move upward, and that's just not practical.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not even obvious that things are going to be that cleanly leveled out anyways. There's a philosopher at the University of Chicago, I think he's emeritus now, Bill Wimsatt, and he has this beautiful, he works in the ontology of science, and he has these wonderful diagrams where things are pretty clean at the very bottom, moving up through chemistry maybe, but when you get to anything around the life sciences, it's just sort of like a jumbled mess, kind of. Very small molecules can have outsized effects on the entire system, for example. And you can there's so many examples of this in neuroscience.
Well, like just strong recreational psychoactive drugs, for example.
Yes, for example. Or that would be one good example. I don't know, I wouldn't know personally, but then also just thinking about the action of distributed neurotransmitter systems and things like that, or even thinking about the way that memory works. There's different ideas about how memory works. Some people actually think it's even all the way down to the genes, or computation even it has to do with immediate early genes and things like that. Whereas I'm like, no, it's all neurons or whatever. But there's the reality is that it's this kind of tangle mess of levels and entities at different spatiotemporal scales that are able to influence each other.
It's not surprising to me that things would get messier once you get to biology, because evolution is acting, I think it's reasonable to say evolution acts on a somewhat low level. Like, you change a gene and then proteins get changed, and that maybe leads to a change in behavior. But it's clear that you have to consider the implementation details in biology, because there's a big constraint on what the system can do based on what evolution could have plausibly found for the system. And that's a kind of multi-level thing going on.
Yeah. So what do you guys think about this 3M constraint? That's really this major contribution.
Yeah, so that's pretty core. Let's summarize this idea first.
I can read the explicit definition and then we can unpack it. A model of a target phenomenon explains the phenomenon to the extent that A, the variables in the model correspond to identifiable components, activities, and organizational features of the target mechanism that produces, maintains, or underlies the phenomenon, and B, the perhaps mathematical dependencies posited among these perhaps mathematical variables in the model correspond to causal relations among the components of the target mechanism.
Okay, so to summarize the 2 points, I guess the first one is saying that there's a correspondence between the model and the underlying stuff going on in like the real physics. And then the second is that the relationships between the things that you're modeling are causal, basically.
Yeah.
So that sounds almost just like an application of the definition of mechanism.
Yep.
Is it much more than that? I guess correspondence is part of it, but that seems implicit in the definition of a mechanism to some extent.
Yeah, I think it is. That's why it's 3M is, right? Model mechanism mapping. I think it's just making explicit how these mechanistic models are applied to these kinds of complex systems. Of course, there's nothing special about the brain here, right? You could apply this same definition to ecology, to an ecosystem or something like that, or any other kind of complex. So, there's a lot going on here. Should we try and unpack this?
Yeah, can you at least start by highlighting how this differs from previous work or, things put forth?
Sure. So you'll recall from the history brief I gave earlier that a dominant model for many decades was this idea of a covering law explanation, where you have a universal generalization, a statement of natural law, and you have initial conditions, a statement of sort of what values the various variables in your law take, and then you deduce the explanandum, the thing you're trying to explain. You'll note here that there is not really any of those things. Law doesn't play a role at all, and deduction isn't explicitly mentioned at all. And instead you start talking about things like correspondence or some sorts of mapping between the parts of the model and the parts of the world, and a mapping between the relationships between the parts of the model and the relations or interrelations that the parts of the world stand in. So that's already very different from sort of the traditional approach. Another thing you'll get too is that you're no longer just describing how things behave. Perhaps that's covered by B in the description of the dependencies, but even when you're just talking about input-output behavior, you're not necessarily imputing a robust causal organization into the description of the system. Whereas here it's saying, it's got to be this causal relations among the components of the mechanism. And we can maybe talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about the difference between phenomenal or merely descriptive models and mechanistic models, because that's one of the key differences. But those are some of the initial major ways that this definition departs from some of the historical takes on scientific explanation.
But so to be clear, it doesn't differentiate itself. Like, it is consistent with the sort of standard 30-year-old paradigm of calling scientific models mechanistic or viewing scientific models.
That's right. It is formalizing in a fashion the underlying principle for many of those types of explanations.
So this 3M part, this is not specific to computational neuroscience. The 3M part is a statement that could apply generally for like the whole class of mechanistic modeling, or when judged as academic philosophical work, this paper contributes the sort of concrete specialization of this whole mechanistic science view to computational neuroscience specifically. That's right. Yeah. Okay. And I actually, I think there's some problems with 3M, and I'm happy to talk about my issues with them. But generally speaking, I think it does capture an ideal in some way, at least for some types of explanations in cognitive and computational neuroscience.
Can I guess at the problems with it, or I can?
I'm very curious to hear what you guys think. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll phrase it as I'll describe my problems with it, but insofar as there is a right answer, then this is just a guess. I feel like it is a bit circular because it kind of includes in the definition that it is correct, because it says like the, parts of the system that are responsible for maintaining the phenomenon that's trying to be explained. So it kind of bakes in two notions. One of like the model has to be relatable to the world in some way, but also it has to be the correct model, it seems like. And this kind of comes up, he talks about how possibly versus how actually as types of models. And this problem came up to me in that description as well. It just seems like there's something confused about baking in this has to be true, or at least maybe it's not confused, but it doesn't help me as a scientist because my whole problem is I don't know what is true. So I can't look at a model and be like, that's a mechanistic explanation because it corresponds with the truth. Like I'm trying to understand the truth. So it just feels like you need to be omniscient or something to actually verify that this is a mechanistic explanation.
Yeah, we can talk about that. That's an interesting objection. And if I might recapitulate it briefly, really what you're saying is, in order for me to be able to apply this constraint, I need to already know everything I might want to know about the system. Namely, the features of the target mechanism that underlie the phenomenon. But that's the thing I'm trying to find out. And if I don't already have those details in hand, then this constraint is not very much help.
Or at least this isn't a very useful heuristic to scientists. I mean, I guess I like, without digressing too much, like a lot of people in science, I don't really love this definition, but a lot of people in science really like the Karl Popper falsification kind of notion of science, right? Where it's like, something is a scientific statement if it could in principle be falsified by some hypothetical evidence that you might gather against it or something like that. And I think part of why scientists like that is because it is like a heuristic that could guide.
It's actionable.
Right, yeah. Whereas this statement, while it is, to me, actually, I actually kind of like the philosophical elegance of a statement where it's like, there is a real model of the world, and you're going to posit a model, and it is, true insofar as there's a correspondence between your model and the sort of underlying model that, like, you're approximating the sort of real model of the world or something like this. That's, like, philosophically nice, and, that's maybe actionable kind of in statistics, like a little bit epistemologically. Like you can do model comparisons where you say like, how much evidence do I have for this model versus another model? So I think maybe there's a domain in which this philosophical worldview could be operationalized a little bit. A little bit. It's indirect in terms of how practitioners of science could apply it.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you just said. There is one strand of philosophy of science where what philosophers of science do sometimes isn't really meant to be so helpful for the practice. Instead, it's meant to rationally reconstruct what scientists have done. So instead of actually looking at the dirty details of how science proceeds, what the rational reconstruction of science is instead is a kind of looking back on and tidying up the details of the research that's gone on before and saying, oh, well, here's this complicated research program that resulted in these nice, interesting findings, but what we really should do is go back and pick out the strong conceptual threads and how in a reconfigured explanation or description of that research process did one finding lead to another and so forth. And this has the flavor more of that kind of thing where he's saying, all right, well, these are the good models, and the reason they're good models is because they map onto what we know about the system in terms of its components, activities, and organization, as well as in terms of the dependencies between those parts.
So I guess I didn't see Grace's objection before she said it, but even as you re-summarize it, actually, with now Grace has primed me for this, like, it does feel like that retrospective, though, is actually still hard to do and a bit circular. It's like, how do you even retrospectively go back and say this is a good model? right? Like I like it, but it's like now I'm looking back at it and it's like, okay, so we've got these models that we think are good because they adhere to data. Like there's evidence to support them. And now we're looking back at these models of the world and we're saying these are good ones because they correspond to reality. Like retrospectively, it almost feels like that's part of, like even in the sort of retrospective rationalization that you're...
Rational reconstruction, yeah. I mean, certainly there's a little bit of the reason it's a good model is because it's a good model.
That's weird. I missed this, yeah.
Yeah. And I haven't actually, I'd have to think a little bit more deeply about that particular issue, because that isn't what struck me about this claim as a constraint.
Okay, so that is the end of part 1. We're leaving it on a cliffhanger. If you want to know David's objections to the 3M model, you will have to listen to part 2. We also get into more specific examples of models in computational neuroscience and whether or not those models fit the philosophical ideals laid out in this paper. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.